Hey, I just took the JLPT exam, just got my results. I want to show you guys um, the mistakes that I made and also how the experience went for the JLPT. So, got my results on 25th of January, which was about a week ago. I took the exam, I think 5 December, and I got, let's see, the scores I got was 107 out of 180. Which comes out to about 58% if you were to do the numerator into the denominator type of thing. However, I got assigned a letter A, or I scored an A for each section of the test, the vocabulary, grammar, and listening. And in order to get an A, what that signifies is that I got more than 67% of all the questions for that particular section correct. So when you wonder, like, well, what does 107 out of 180 mean? I'm not sure, but I think it's on a bell curve. So it may mean that I did better than 58% of the test takers. Not really sure, but that was the overall score. So I did take it here in Japan. I live in Okinawa, and there was only one test site in Okinawa, the prefecture that I live in. It's a small island, so there's only so many places you could go. But it was at one of the universities in Naha. And COVID's been hitting pretty tough here in the local area, especially in this prefecture, because it's like a COVID hotspot in Japan. And I was wondering who's going to show up with all the COVID going on. So to my surprise, there's actually a lot of southeastern looking people, like people from India and whatnot. And I've been living in Japan for almost 3 years, and I haven't seen a huge Indian population here. But they're coming by like the busloads, and maybe that makes sense. I don't really go to Naha, which is probably the more diverse place in Okinawa. So there's probably that's probably where they all live, because I live like in a military neighborhood where it's mostly like Americans and local Okinawans that live here. When I arrived to the test site, I had to look at where the crowds of people were going, and I followed them. And there was some people that were wearing like name badges or whatever. So I thought they were the employees. They were. I approached them, and they're like, "Show me your papers or your test certificate." We all had to print one out before we showed up. And I did, and then they directed me to my classroom. Each level of the JLPT has its own classroom, and there's 5 levels. I was taking the N5, which is the lowest level, and they directed me to my classroom. They were very courteous and nice. When I entered the classroom, it was a super sterile environment. It was, I wouldn't call it intimidating, but it was very sterile. It was very quiet. It was tense. People, you could tell that they were getting nervous for taking this big test. And the Japanese proctors take their test taking very seriously. You're only allowed certain things into the classroom. I think it was like you could have 2 pencils and an eraser, and the eraser had to have the wrapping completely removed, like no paper or plastic around it. Couldn't have any bags or water bottles or extra erasers or extra pencils. And people were getting corrected. They're like, hey, from the proctors, they were like walking around and be like, you got to remove the wrapping from your eraser and things like that. So it's quite serious. And they were setting that tone. So I think a lot of people felt that. So everyone was really quiet. But there's no rule that said I had to be quiet prior to the test starting. I was looking around. The guy who's sitting in front of me, I could tell he was a Marine right away because we both have the same haircut. I started talking to him, just being like, hey, what are you here for? And things like that. He explained to me that he's married to an Okinawan. He's been on the island for quite a while. And I asked him, like, hey, why are you taking the test? And he says, I just, I want to see how good I am. And, people take the test for many different reasons. He was taking it for the same reason that I was. I was like, hey, I just self-study this language, and I want some other outside entity to grade me and tell me how good I'm doing. Am I wasting my time or whatever like that? And so he just wanted to see what his proficiency was as well. But people are mostly taking this test for economic reasons. Immigrants come to Japan, and they want jobs, and employers here in Japan utilize the government's test, the JLPT, the Japanese language proficiency test, to determine a person's proficiency in Japanese for a particular job. So like I said, there's 5 different levels, N5 through N1 being the hardest, and each level provides the employer an ability to understand like what proficiency the person's at. So obviously you can't just say you want all your jobs to have N1 proficiency. Like if you're a bagger at a supermarket, you probably only need an N5 proficiency to be a bagger at a supermarket. Whereas like maybe if you're a manager in charge of other people, you probably need like at least N4, N3 proficiency. And if you're going to be like a businessman going to like business meetings, or maybe your employer requires lots of like peer-to-peer or customer interactions and things like that, explanations and just a high competence or requirement for communication, you're probably looking at closer to that N2 and N1 proficiency range for that employment opportunity. So when the test began, all the instructions were given in Japanese, which was actually quite a shock. I mean, what was I supposed to expect? I should have probably just expected that, but I was shocked nonetheless. Obviously I've been taking tests my whole life and the instructions are always in English. I've taken foreign language courses in high school and college, and the instructions are usually also in English too. But this is the first time where it was not in English. And so when the instructions were given in Japanese, I was like, oh shit, look, this is kind of serious. And unfortunately, I didn't know all the instruction vocabulary. I've been studying the textbook for this test, and I don't think the textbook taught me like a lot of the vocabulary that's just in the instructions for the test. But I can't say that I went into the water completely in the deep end, because the days prior to the test, I went on the JLPT website and they have some practice problems on there. So I was able to familiarize myself with how the questions were going to look like. And I was still underwater nonetheless, but let's just say I wasn't in the deep end. So going through the test, if you've taken it before, you know the first section for the N5 is vocabulary, followed by grammar, followed by listening. Each section has a 20-minute break in between. I'd say for the vocabulary, I was pretty solid. I felt that my preparation using my Anki flashcards for vocabulary set me up pretty well for that portion of the exam. Can't say the same for grammar. That was a lot more tougher. There's some interesting methods that they use to test your grammar on the JLPT. And then the final section was listening. So in the final break before the listening portion, I was eating bananas and crackers, just restoring my brain with more glucose, trying to just not bonk out as my brain was like quickly depleting all its energy sources from the first portions. So the listening portion was going to begin. They started giving the directions in Japanese again. I was, kind of confused, but I was like, hey, if I just listen for the number 1, I'll know that they're on question number 1. Eventually, I heard them giving a question. I never heard the question number 1 being given, but they give the question, and then all of a sudden, like I hear the number 1, and I was kind of like confused. I didn't really understand what was going on, but I had the answer from the first question, and I put it down. But then I was like, okay, maybe I just missed them say number 1 the first time I said it, and now they're just like restating the question. And then I heard another question happen, and I was just really confused. And then I very quickly realized the first question was not the first question. It was actually an example question, because then I looked at my Scantron and there was a section for example question answer. The first question was an example question. I was supposed to put the answer to that in the example question spot of the Scantron. And then after that was the test questions. Completely missed that. By the time I kind of caught on to what was going on, I was like 3 questions into the test. To make things worse, I also was expecting each question to be repeated, because when I went on the JLPT website, they repeated each question twice before you went to the next question. So when I was like waiting around for the repeat, and I thought they were just kind of like giving me like the second half to a question or something, I don't know why I was thinking that, they were actually going into the next questions. And I was just really behind the power curve. I'm not sure how I did on those first 3 questions. I probably got them wrong because I was just trying to figure out what was going on. I wasn't even like really listening to the speaker, the audio tapes that were giving the questions, because I was just trying to figure out where I was in the test. So that was a pretty bad mistake. So after the test, I waited for the proctors to take my test exam material away. Again, it was very sterile and procedural-like. And outside, said my farewells to that Marine acquaintance that I made. He was going to pass because when we were talking about some of the questions during the break, I knew that his proficiency was like way better than mine. He probably had very little business taking the N5 exam. He probably should have been taking the N4 or N3 exam. So I'm sure he did fine. So unfortunately, the JLPT exam they don't release the test scores right after you take the exam. Like I said, I took it in early December, and I didn't get my results until the end of January. And I knew that because that's what they said. I don't know why it takes that long, but it did. As I was waiting for my exam, I went on a 10-day vacation to mainland Japan, visited Nara, Osaka, and Kyoto. And it was the first time that I vacationed to the mainland where I did not need to actually ask "Eigo ga hanashimasu ka," which is, do you speak English? I was able to actually vacation for 10 days in mainland Japan, never asking that question. I was able to use my broken Japanese and get by, which is a very fulfilling experience, really cool cultural immersion. And of course, my Japanese got a little bit better by forcing me into these situations too. During the vacation, after the vacation, I continued to do my minimum 1 hour study each day of Japanese. And then one day, like a week or two ago, got my test results, and I was ecstatic because I was really concerned about passing that exam. I didn't know if I was going to pass because of how poorly I thought I did during the listening portion, just knowing that I was completely lost during that entire portion, or at least the beginning of the portion. But I passed. I got the N5, and that was great. I'm still studying Japanese about almost an hour a day, but I'm not putting as much focus into it as I was before to prepare for the N5 exam. I'm kind of shifting my focuses towards Spanish now, and then I'm still studying Portuguese and German. I'm probably putting at least an hour into Spanish every day. I'm probably doing about 40 minutes of Japanese a day, somewhere between 5 to 10 minutes for both German and Portuguese each. But right now, Spanish is becoming more of a priority for me. I just got orders back to America. I'm moving to San Diego this summer. So Japanese is going to lose some importance and precedence in my life, while Spanish is going to gain a lot in Southern California, of course. So we're going to see where this journey takes me. I don't foresee quitting my Japanese studies at all. I do eventually plan to test out of N1. Of course, my next step would be N4 before I get to that. But it's a lifelong journey. We don't study languages just to stop our studying one day and just be like, okay, this is good enough. Even with your first language, like even me for English, I have to continue to read all the time to increase my vocabulary and my ability to think in English better. It's how I become smarter in English. And the same is true for all the other languages. You never reach an endpoint. I just took an English test exam of how many words in English I know, and apparently I know like way less than half the words. Said like I knew like 20,000 words or something, and there's about, I think, 40,000 words in the English language or something like that. So you never master your own language, so it's definitely impossible to master a second or third or fourth or fifth language that you learn. But what you could do is just get better and better, and it's a lifelong experience. Right now, I'm reading Spanish novels. I'm reading the third Harry Potter right now in Spanish, and I'm reading Sapiens right now as well. So if you enjoy hearing these little stories, please subscribe to my channel. I usually just do this for my family, especially since I live abroad, my family and friends, so they get just an opportunity to see what I'm doing. But I like hearing from the random strangers that I occasionally get comments from and stuff like that. Channel's mostly about traveling, learning like languages, put my music compositions on here as well. So feel free to join, and have a good day. Thanks.